Let's talk about Lloyd Tilghman. It is pronounced Tilghman, T-I-L-L. And had a really short life, only lived 47 years. Very highly thought of by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Did not know the man, but he was really impressed with what he did at Fort Henry, which we'll talk about here. His defense of Fort Henry. You might have seen him. This is a picture of him. You might have seen this shot of him. You probably more than likely have seen this picture of him down at the National Military Park. This was paid for and erected by two of his sons, which we'll talk about later. The sculptor was, his name was Frederick Sievers. He was an American sculptor, but he had studied in Rome and Paris, and apparently his specialty was doing Confederate Civil War military officers. This is a shot, another statue paid for his sons, again, in Paducah, Kentucky, where he lives for a while. This is just a timeline of kind of where he lived in life. Louisiana Purchase is way down here. He was born in 1816. All these wars were going on while he was alive. He enrolled at the at West Point here at 15 years old, by the way. And here he's killed in battle in 1863.
Do you object to me taking a picture?
No,
You could go back one notch.
There. My key,
Thank you.
you can't turn that one off. I can turn the key. Got it? By the way, 2017. They're still debating his statues and legacy and what should be where, should be displayed. This was my attempt at a timeline. I had a hard time making this work in PowerPoint. That's it. In his early years, he was born up in Maryland, what they called Rich Neck Manor, in a very well-to-do family, very historic, very wealthy Tilghman family, owned most of Cabot County, all in this area. He was born right up in this area. To this day, this island out here is still called Tilghman Island. Oddly enough, in today's world, the biggest issue is not development in that area, but land erosion. Small family. Had two sisters. He was the only boy, one older, one younger. His great-grandson in this Matthew Tilghman, who I'd also never heard of. But he was a leader of the Maryland Revolutionary Movement during the Revolutionary War. And his family was very big on separating from Great Britain. He was originally would have been a signer to the Declaration of Independence, but he was called back to Maryland because they needed to put a state constitution together to form a state to form an army to give to Washington for the war. And a person named Charles Carrollton was named in his place as he was signed on the Declaration of Independence. I found no signs of his early childhood up until he was age 15. I don't know what he did. He was born and then showed up at the Westport at the military again. I don't know what he did. At 15, he enters the West Point. I would think even back then, when you're 15 years old and in college, it would be difficult, both academically and physically. He did it. It took him 5 years to get through it, but he made it. He was ranked 46 out of 49 in his class, which, as we all know, people like John McCain, he was fourth out of fourth from the bottom, 400 people. Didn't stop him from being successful. When he graduated, there were no positions available. But shortly after, there was apparently somebody, best I can tell, several people either declined their commissions or after they were commissioned, quit and went into civilian jobs. Apparently you were able to do that back in those days because there was such a demand for engineering type people during that time frame, which would have been the second industrial revolution. Apparently they let them do that. These are just some of the other people, nobody in particular. These were the top. Might want to pay attention to this name right here, Joseph Anderson. And he resigned after 15 months. Another engineer, owner, chief executive of a place called Traeger Iron Foundry in Richmond, Virginia, which is predominant in southern manufacturing. Just a few more. This listing is something called the Cullum's Registry, what they used to keep track of all the graduates from West Point, and kind of a quick description of who they were, what they did, whether they were killed, what they participated in. These with the stars on them, this resigned immediately. Railroad engineer, lawyer, and politician. Resigned within a year, civilian educator. Resigned within a year, a physician. Resigned right away, Pennsylvania lawyer. Here's our boy Lloyd Tilghman. He was 46 out of 49. He ended up being a railroad engineer, Confederate General, so on and so forth. These are out of the 49 members in his class that he graduated with. 16 of them fought in the Civil War, 4 for the South and 12 for the North. What we're looking at here is all these people he was with in his class were all successful, whether they stayed in or left. So he gets out of West Point, and apparently he gets bored, or he's attracted to work as an engineer for the railroad. So in 1836, I just graduated in 1836, he resigns his commission, works as an engineer for several different railroads throughout the South. Did that for quite a few years. Along the way, marries his wife. Seeks to have 7 children, 5 slaves. I've found sources for anywhere from 5 to 8 children, but I can find names for 7, so going to 7. In 1845, he rejoins the Army, fights in the Mexican-American War for 2 years. He joins as I believe as a lieutenant. But as soon as he got there, they found out that he was a West Point graduate, and they said, well, we got better things for you to do. So he was spent most of his time designing fortifications and operating light artillery pieces. After that war is over, he returns to civilian life as an engineer of railroads. He's either got a desire for railroad construction, or they just kept coming after him. He moves to Kentucky, continues his career with the New Orleans, Jackson, and Mobile, Ohio. These railroads don't mean anything to me, but they were apparently some of the major railroads in the South that revolutionized trade in the South in later years. In July of '61, he joins the Confederate Army as a colonel. Now, he did not do this because of his thoughts on slavery, even though he was a slave owner. He was mad at the North because the federal troops would come down to Kentucky, which was still a neutral state at the time. And they would come down to Kentucky and recruit farmers and civilians for federal service. And he thought that was wrong for them to be allowed to do that while they were a neutral state. He didn't like that. But he said the Northerners gave him no choice but to align with the South. Now here it joins in July of 1861. In October of '61, he's already a brigadier general. Everywhere he goes, he starts here and immediately says, "Oh, you can do this. We're taking you up to this state." Right after that, he was selected to build the two sister forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, to protect the waterways of the South. Now, he did not pick these positions. The governor of Tennessee chose those, Isham Harris, who had no military background at all, but he was in favor of not destroying our president. Got to do what he wanted. Delegated the job to General Donelson, one fort was named for him. Tilghman showed up and said, "Well, this is a terrible place to build one of these forts." Fort Donelson was about 100 feet above the river. Fort Henry was 2 feet above normal river pool. And he called it a wretched military position. History of military and engineering records no parallel case. He didn't care much for the place, but he did the best he could to build it. These are the two forts. It's Donelson, about 100 foot above Cumberland River. Fort Henry over here, it's at 356 foot above sea level. Normal pool's at 354. Fort Hyman, whom he decided to build on the other side of the river, was up at 440 feet, where they could shoot down to Union occupiers as they came up the river. He also noticed that rivers in this area, if you're not familiar with them, the river current flows from south to north just because of elevation changes. So that worked to the Union's favor, in that as they came upriver, they were fighting the current, but the current acts as an anchor, as opposed to dragging an anchor to position yourself going down. If you're a boater, it's easier to navigate going uphill. This is just another relative position of these forts. These 2 points are 12, 15 miles apart, as I recall. Now down here at Fort Henry, 1861, the first General Grant decides to make a bold move and does a winter, February attack on Fort Hyman here. Where Fort Hyman was still being built, wasn't well armed. There was only 2,800 troops there. And General Grant had 15,000 troops coming at them. So they decide to be feet out of there and escape to Fort Henry. The Union showed up at Fort Hyman over here and still found warm soup on the tables that he left so fast. Fort Henry, they regrouped and put up a much better fight against these Union ironclads. It took Grant a little longer to get back up, bring his troops back around. Again, this is in the winter, it's frozen and soggy ground. At this time, though, because of the February thaws and frozen and rain, this river is already into Fort Henry. It's got 2 feet of water in it already. They put up a gallant fight, apparently, and damaged several of the Union ironclads up here. And that was even with damp gunpowder, and some of their guns were totally underwater, the ones closer to the river. As it turned out, if they would have just waited 2 days on the Union side, this river, or this fort, was totally underwater 2 days later. There had been no battle at all. But in just a little over an hour, Fort Henry is lost. Tilghman knows it. He takes his troops and sends the bulk of them to go crossland over to Fort Donelson. He stays with a small contingent at Fort Henry to cover the rear guard and put up a fight to let them escape, knowing full well that he would lose to Grant. He would have to surrender to Grant, and he'd be taken prisoner for probably the rest of the war. Talk a minute about these ironclads that they were fighting against. These were called poop turtles, city class. These things were, there's 12 inches of timber around all sides of these things and 2.5 inches of iron on the fronts and the sides, but not on the back and not on the top. So these ironclads were vulnerable to plunging fire from overhead. You could get on top of them or loft one over the top and get into them. You go right through the top and sometimes hit their boilers. The other thing was, these things carried up to 250 men. I had no idea there was that many people in ships. They were called poop turtles. Poop was the guy that designed them. Turtles was because they were flat-bottomed and ramped at the front edges, kind of like a turtle, and they could go up on shore. They only had a 6-foot draft, so they were good for inland river waterways. Not to be confused with like the Monitor, and Merrimack, and all of them, that were much heavier, bigger, and heavier, and had 10, 12-foot drafts for open seas. Again, this is where this is in today's world. This is now Kentucky Lake, dammed up here at the Ohio River. This is the Cumberland River. This is Lake Barkley, also dammed right there at the Ohio. In today's world, Fort Henry is out in the middle of the lake. I think there's a movie out there marked. This is where the fort was. It's not a historical marker, I don't believe. There's obstructions right here. There is parts of Fort Hyman up on the bluffs that I believe are still there. I say Fort Hyman, Grant used a late winter surprise attack with superior numbers. Captured Fort Hyman by a fight, they just walked away. Fort Henry is a loss, even though they put up a good fight. And he sends the bulk of his forces to Fort Donelson and stays behind. He's taken prisoner by the Union and sent to Fort Warren in Boston. And then in just the fall of '62, a very short time, he's released, traded for General John Reynolds, who was one of the designers or layouts of the left wing of the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Fort Donelson, then, with Tilghman out of the picture, Grant marches his men across the frozen terrain to surround Donelson. This is a pretty heavy fight, apparently. The Navy arrives on the Cumberland, but the South does plunging type attacks on the ironclads and takes several hits. Admiral Foote, who was in command of this, he was pretty bold after his victory at Fort Henry. And in less than an hour and a half, he has to retreat with heavy damage to several of the ships, and he's severely injured. The Confederates realize that the fort is lost, and they attempt to break out and move, but there is a total lack of coordination and leadership on the South's part. The generals that are in charge, General Floyd and Pillow, they decide they don't want to stick around here. It's going to be a losing fight, so they flee. And General Buckner has to do the best he can. And this is where Grant comes up with the only way you can get out of this is unconditional immediate surrender. He captured 12,000 troops in the process. So in the fall of 1802, after he's traded for another general, he returns to the field as a brigade commander in the West for Earl von Dorn's army. That was later joined up with the Army of Mississippi for defense of Vicksburg. And now we're up to 1863. And in the bloodiest part of the Vicksburg campaign, the Battle of Champion, the Confederates were defeated and were forced to retreat back to Vicksburg. Here again, we got a losing battle, and Tilghman is ordered to stay behind and guard the rear so that everybody else can escape. Tilghman apparently puts up a battle here. It's all day, but Grant reinforces with more troops. Pemberton orders a retreat. Tilghman's trying to cover the rear of the retreating Pemberton's spread out army all over the place. But during the retreat, he dismounts from his horse to help adjust an artillery piece. And at that point in time, just as he got off the horse, he was hit by a piece of 3-inch exploding artillery that apparently passed through his chest and also kills his horse standing right behind him. He dies in his teenage son's arms right there. According to the North prisoners, that was the last shot the North had fired in that battle. There is a marker where this battlefield was at. Of course, the Vicksburg campaign. There were some major players here. 32,000 troops on one side, 22,000 on the other. The aftermath, though, is after Tilghman was killed there, they carried him to Vicksburg and buried him in a military cemetery there. I have conflicting sources as to where it was, but it's probably Cedar Hill Cemetery, north of Vicksburg. A marker was set there, the best they could tell, as to where he was actually hit by that shell fragment, but it's deep on private property, you can't get there. Much later, up here in 1901, he's relocated to the Bronx in New York City and buried next to his wife. Augusta. So this is probably the Cedar Hill Cemetery down in Vicksburg. Not real confident on that. Now he's buried in New York City. Notice here, he's relocated by his boys in Woodlawn Cemetery in Bronx, buried next to his wife. You notice these two boys keep coming up over and over again. And here's a picture. This is probably the more well-known shot, I think, of him.
Steve,
yes.
I'll just comment for anyone else that hasn't seen that statue in person. There's hundreds of statues and monuments and memorials at Vicksburg National Military Park. That's got to be the most dramatic statue in the park.
It's
Just recreating the moment of Tilghman and his horse's death.
That's not a pose you would normally see anywhere.
No.
Would one of the two surviving boys be one of the teenagers that he supposedly died in his arms?
No.
No.
I'll get to that one.
Okay. Sorry.
You're reading ahead.
I'm sorry.
The Tilghman house is still there. I don't know if that's what we're actually going to be seeing when we're down there. I don't know what our plan is there. The house is open for tours. After receiving news of his death, his wife moved from their home in Kentucky, goes to New York City. 1902, his two eldest surviving sons, Seidel, had their father's body moved, and they buried him alongside the brother. And then they go on this, they're erecting monuments for him everywhere they go. They also donated a large sum of money to the city of Paducah with the stipulation that a school would be built in honor of their mother. That's the Augusta Tilghman High School. It was later rebuilt as a new school and named short to Paducah Tilghman High School. Now, Lloyd Tilghman Jr., this is the oldest son number one. He served in the Confederate military. He died at age 17, not just a couple months after Dad fell from his horse. The next two boys, these two here, these are the ones, they moved to New York City and they become successful on the New York Stock Exchange. That's where they are able to fund all these monuments and markers. Their other children, of the name people I could find names for, I don't find notable. Like I said, they did. Augusta Tilghman High School is still there and active. The Tilghman name in the United States, if you got a name that's spelled like this, you're almost definitely from this guy here, who originally sailed from England. The spelling of this name, because it's pronounced Tilghman, there was a lot of different ways it could be spelled after you got here. Apparently nobody really cared how you spelled it. But the Tilghmans, their name comes up multiple times in history. The grandfather was the father of the Maryland Revolution. This guy, he was a trusted aide to George Washington. He was famously depicted as delivering the news after the British surrender at Yorktown. Sarah Tillman Hughes is the Supreme Court Justice that swore in Lyndon B. Johnson. University. other people with same spelling. You know, they've got quite a heritage, apparently. I don't know if they're all trying to follow or what, but there's a guy that's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Pennsylvania Supreme Court. It seems like all these Tilghmans, they've all got something to prove in life. They're either following in somebody else's footsteps, or they're making a path of their own. Here's one who later became famous as the inventor of the sandblasting process. I don't have near this list. But in general, this man was remembered as a brave but controversial leader. But he was just ordered to do it. He didn't pick the spot. And had nothing to do with laying it out, didn't survey it. If he would have surveyed it, he would have known that it was at a floodplain. It was really only chosen because it was a direct shot of gunboats coming up the river toward the south, but not in a floodplain. And all of us that live in this county, you can tell where the floodplain is by the grass and the trees and the brush, how it's marked, damaged by rising waters. How they did that, and why, it's hard to say. He was praised for his work on the railroads. One of his enduring legacies was the Panama Railroad, 47 miles long, which was done before the Panama Canal. And the Panama Railroad was used as a passage from two sides before the canal was there. And it was later used by the Americans to build the Panama Canal to haul dirt. And it's still used today, although it's been redone with modern gauge rails. So, his engineering and surveying work from back then is still in use today. But you have to wonder if this governor had not picked the locations of these two forts, Tilghman would not have surrendered the grant, would not have been traded for General Reynolds, who had his hands in the Gettysburg battlefield, and he may not have been killed in the Battle of Champion Hill. And there's some things I found, sources that I found of interesting things about the man. And that's about all I have to say about this. I'll turn it over.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
Since he was an engineer and he was in the Mexican-American War, was he familiar with Lee or Beauregard? They were both engineers in the Mexican-American War.
I don't know that.
It's very possible because you guys Beauregard, Tilghman, McClellan, Lee, they were all part of Scott's Special Scouts engineers.
Well, they would determine the routes around the American Army and the placement of the
Lee was
artillery.
most of that. But they helped him, or they also kind of, but they were the scouts for Scott.
So he was with them in Mexico and not up in Texas with.
Right. He was down in Mexico.
Yes.
Steve, I was fascinated by your mention that Tilghman entered West Point at the ripe old age of 15. So I took a minute, and this is what I found, that current regulations require cadets to be between the ages of 17 and 22 on July 1st of the year of their admittance to the academy. But the youngest man ever was even younger than Tilghman. Henry Brewerton enrolled at West Point at the age of 12. He went on, Henry Brewerton went on to be superintendent of the academy in the 1840s and into the early 1850s.
What was his, did they have fields of study in that era? What did he major?
I think Brewerton was engineer also.
Yeah, I think almost all of them were engineers, up until comparatively recently.
Yeah, I mean, this era,
I'm just surprised that teenagers, young teenagers, not even teenager, 12, got a congressional appointment to the academy at that age. You know, they couldn't find anybody of a more appropriate age.
yeah.
It was peacetime.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Peacetime military service.
Nobody was interested in going to the academy.
I mean, this was kind of a cross, after the first industrial revolution, but the second with combustion engines, but before the third. But apparently that was his niche. All these guys were big into construction. They knew how to make it happen.
Most of the junior officers during the Mexican-American War were graduates of West Point. Grant was, Sherman, all of them, Hancock, Pickett, all the city. When anybody mentioned it, Lincoln, he would defend the Lincoln got him to West Point. Most of the junior officers were West Point graduates. Not your older officers, but most of the junior officers were West Point graduates.
In that era, was the admissions requirements still the same, or you had to have some kind of,
Had to
senator,
be appointed by somebody.
somebody, so many, your priest, clergymen, or school teachers. How does a 12 or a 15-year-old get that?
Peacetime, they take anybody that expressed an interest in getting in, right?
I can't imagine that they'd graduate after a 4-year term there at West Point and get appointed to command troops. I mean, what kind of troops would follow a 16-year-old unless they were like 15, 16 themselves, which is not out of the realm of possibility either.
But here's the other interesting thing. So at West Point, the top cadets went into the engineer corps. Now today, the top cadets go to combat arms. But back then, they went engineers. He was fourth from the bottom. And that, it doesn't say where he went, but it's interesting he then became an engineer after that. So I wonder, it looks like he was an artillery officer maybe in Mexico, although he did do fortifications, but he's probably in the artillery branch, which today is fine. Today it's ideal for a West Pointer to go into artillery, infantry, but then it wasn't, but it's just interesting. So he went into artillery, but then, even though he was at the bottom of his class, that West Point degree was so coveted that everybody made him an engineer.
Yeah,
If I didn't tell him he was fourth from the bottom.
It didn't matter at that
Just like the doctor who graduates last in his class.
He's still called doctor. Yeah. So anyway.
And by the time the Civil War rolled around, he was a combat veteran.
Yeah,
So he had value beyond whatever educational background he started out with.
We put a lot of time in on getting all this together. That's really fascinating to me, presentation.
Most of it's still in the binder. I never.
I don't know how many man hours got into that, but somebody did a lot of work.
I did a lot of research, but most of it never made it this far.
This may be more of an observation than a real question. Fairly early on, you talked about his, when he got to Kentucky, he didn't agree with how the Union was coming down to Kentucky and used the word recruit. Do you know the methods they were using for recruiting? Strong arming farmers to become foot soldiers or something. I don't know, but I don't know if this happened before the North initiated the draft, but that draft in the North was highly unpopular.
Yeah, that would have been before the grant. Most of, yeah, there were spots in Kentucky that were pure back the Union, didn't want to go with the South. And most of those guys joined the Union Army on their own, they weren't coerced into it.
Yeah, and so my observation is kind of, you know, at the drop of a hat, he decides he doesn't like their methodology. And I use the expression, they left him no choice but to join the Confederate side. I'm thinking, you know, we should have switched pretty easily here. I don't know if switching is the right word even. But again, that's kind of, you know,
From what I understand, Kentucky at the time, they had so many ties to the north for business with the Ohio River. And siding with the South would have cut them off from all the business trade. And being right in the middle, they would have been, they knew they'd be a battleground state for both sides. And they didn't want to be part of any of that, so they decided to be neutral. But in reality, it was just like Missouri, where there were people on both sides that wanted to go one way or the other. When it was General Polk occupied Columbus, Kentucky, that ill-advised and unauthorized move pushed Kentucky to say to the North, we'll come to you because we need, we want to be under your umbrella, we've just been invaded. And that's all because he invaded Columbus.
And Paducah is the first place that Grant occupies. It's his first town. And he issues like this general order that says, hey, we're friends, you know, we're not here to cause any problems, carry on. And Lincoln loved it. He's like, that's the first time Lincoln noticed Grant. And like, that is exactly the tone that we want to set. That's what's going to keep Kentucky in the Union. Love it. So if that irritated Lloyd Tilghman, I think he probably was pretty easily irritated.
But, you know, from what I read out of this is the South attacked Fort Sumter, which allowed Lincoln to have to defend yourself against the South. And then when Polk occupied Columbus, that forced Kentucky into the Union's hands and played right into Lincoln again, saying, you know, we got Kentucky on our side. You didn't have to do a thing. You didn't have to invade and occupy. He was the friendly guys. He was the good guy. But these battles down around Fort Donelson, Pittsburgh, that's what put Grant on the map as Army of the Generals.
Well, didn't like it.
Yeah, and got him up to where he was a rising star at that point.
Hey, Steve. I'm sorry, go ahead, Barry.
I was going to say next month is Nick Sacco here to talk to us about Ulysses S. Grant. I don't remember exactly what he's talking about with that.
I
Maybe
think he was going to talk about the Camp Jackson thing.
that's probably what it is. Okay. He's at the
I've seen him do such a presentation at Whitehaven, and I highly recommend any presentation Nick Sacco gives.
And so Nick's on several YouTube presentations himself. You can see him, like, type in Nick Sacco on YouTube, and he's got a lot of, you know, presentations about St. Louis and the Civil War. So he is a great speaker. He's spoken to us before, one of the best guest speakers we've ever had. And so definitely come back next month. So anyway, thank you, Steve.